The Chateau de Haut-Koenigsbourg, the jewel of the Vosges. Towering over the French region of Alsace from its rocky promontory, the fortress and its outsized reputation cast a shadow stretching far beyond the Alsatian border. The chateau, larger than 5 soccer fields, is a veritable maze, boasting more than 250 rooms, a 20-story tall keep, and defense installations with walls 9 meters thick. This massive fortress, the largest ever built in the region, is simply astonishing.
On a national scale, or even a European one, the Haut-Koenigsbourg is a castle of exceptional size.
First built in the 12th century and then demolished, the Haut-Koenigsbourg was reconstructed between the 15th and 16th centuries, becoming an architectural masterpiece.
The rebuilt castle was a brand new concept. It was very modern and well thought out.
Demolished again in 1633, it was rebuilt almost identically in the early 20th century by a visionary German architect named Bodo Ebert.
At that time in Germany, Bodo Ebert was considered to be the eminent specialist in fortified castles.
Once Alsace was recaptured by Germany in 1871, why did they decide to rebuild such a fortress? And what extraordinary efforts did they take to do so?
The reconstruction of the Haut-Koenigsbourg in the early 20th century was a colossal undertaking. Even today, it will be extremely difficult to accomplish.
Bodo Ebert made use of all the modern technology available at the time to restore and rebuild this castle.
Locomotives, cranes, electricity, no expense was spared to speed the reconstruction process. But the design posed the biggest challenge: how to make the fortress look like a 16th century fortified castle.
The physiognomy of the Haut-Koenigsbourg was the result of how they envisioned the end of the Middle Ages.
To me, it was on the same scale as the Notre-Dame de Paris, the Château de Versailles, and the Chartres Cathedral. The Haut-Koenigsbourg is a true spectacle of architecture.
Now, thanks to the hard work of world-class architectural authorities, precious archives left by previous restorers, and 3D computer graphics, you're about to discover the incredible architectural saga of the Château de Haut-Koenigsbourg. A work of art that has become the symbol of Alsace and its tumultuous history. The Château de Haut-Koenigsbourg, the most legendary of all Alsatian fortresses, towers over the Vosges from its rocky peak. Situated in Alsace, approximately 50 kilometers from Strasbourg, the Haut-Koenigsbourg is part of a region with a tumultuous geographic and political history. For centuries, 2 rival superpowers fought over it. On one side, the Kingdom of France, and on the other, the Holy Roman Empire, to which Alsace belonged during the Middle Ages. The Germanic influence indelibly marked the architecture of the region.
One thing that is particularly striking is that when observing the Crête de Vosges from the plain of Alsace, you notice a constellation of keeps or Burgfrieds that are square in shape. There are very few round keeps in Alsace. We think that's much more of a French influence.
With its square keep, the Haut-Koenigsbourg is a fortified castle on a mountain. Its role was above all a defensive one. This eminently strategic function also gave it particular prestige.
The Haut-Koenigsbourg was clearly a mountain fortress. Sites built high up often appear significantly more opulent and make a much more powerful impression than a castle built on a plain surrounded by a village or one built in a small city.
The castle is perched at the summit of a rocky promontory at over 750 meters in altitude. The building is more than 300 meters long and 40 meters wide, with a 37-meter difference in height between the 2 extremities. Its maze-like plan contains more than 250 rooms. The square keeps, which measures 62 meters, the equivalent of a 20-story building, towers over the landscape and offers a 360-degree view. Surrounding the keep are residential dwellings, as well as a military arsenal that was incredibly modern for the era. The Great Bastion, the Small Bastion, the star-shaped bastion, and the outside enclosure were all erected to protect the fortress. In total, its interior surface area spans over 15,000 square meters, the equivalent of 57 tennis courts, which makes Haut-Koenigsbourg the most imposing fortress ever built in the Vosges.
On a regional scale, but also on a national scale, and perhaps even on a European one, the Haut-Koenigsbourg is exceptionally large. It's a huge castle, but not necessarily in comparison to one built on a plain. Yet for a mountain fortress, it certainly is exceptional in size.
The Haut-Koenigsbourg is an extraordinary castle that still remains intact today. How is that even possible when the vast majority of medieval castles are now in ruins? The reason is simple. Despite appearances, the Haut-Koenigsbourg does not actually date from the end of the Middle Ages. The fortress we see today is the fruit of an integral restoration that dates back to only a little over a century ago. To understand the reasons for this uncommon destiny, we must go back several centuries. The Château de Haut-Koenigsbourg appeared in writings for the first time in 1147. Its name, adapted from German, means High Castle of the King. At this time, Alsace was part of the Holy Roman Empire, headed by the Hohenstaufen family. Under their reign, almost 100 fortified castles were built in the region, an extremely large number for such a small area. For the Hohenstaufens, a lot was at stake.
The Hohenstaufen were a large family that wanted to establish themselves. To do so and to control the territory, the only solution in the 12th century was to build castles. The more castles you built, the stronger you were.
But with almost 100 fortified castles already in existence in the region, why did they build yet another fortress in the heart of a forest with the reputation of being hostile? The answer lies in the prime location of the site. Two major arteries passed at the foot of the castle. From north to south, the wheat and wine route went from Italy to the Netherlands. And from east to west, the salt route and later the ore route crossed the Vosges Massif. This location was therefore not only strategic, but economic as well.
Almost half of Europe's economy depended on these passages. If you controlled the roads and the tolls, you could collect a lot of taxes. So economically speaking, it was crucial.
A few traces of this first castle are still visible today. On the southern flank, Romanesque arcatures are still visible. These are series of 2 or 3 small arcades inlaid in a wall dating from the 12th century. In the upper garden, relatively large portions of the walls can still be observed. Not much remains, but thanks to the rigorous work of archaeologists and a meticulous study of these relics of the past, the shape of the original building can finally be envisioned.
For the longest time, we supposed that in the 12th century, there were 2 distinct castles. The castle was called Koenigsbourg, which was the main central castle, where the majority of the dwellings still in existence are located, and a second castle separated by a moat. After a lot of reflections, studies, and analysis, it is believed that the second castle was in fact the front section of the original one.
According to the archaeologist, the first edifice was composed of a central part with a keep surrounded by living quarters. In the section where the current garden is located, 5 or 6 knights' living quarters were built over time. This second set of buildings, separate from the first, made up the front of the castle. These 2 parts were joined together by a bridge, vestiges of which were discovered. We can thus picture the general shape of the castle as it was in the 12th century. Archaeologists have finally been able to understand the oldest vestiges still present on site, even though several mysteries remain. One thing is certain, the castle changed owners several times over the centuries. And in the 15th century, it found itself in the hands of knights with less than stellar reputations.
On several occasions, these bandits plundered and robbed the merchants passing by, notably on the plain of Alsace. So, in 1462, the cities of Strasbourg, Colmar, and Basel went on a punitive expedition to hunt for the bandits and destroy the first castle, so that other people with bad intentions wouldn't take refuge there and strike again.
At the time, rebuilding was unusual, as doing so was extremely costly. However, in an exceptional twist, the Haut-Koenigsbourg arose from its ashes less than 20 years later.
In 1462, following the demolition of the first castle, the Habsburg family, who reigned over the Holy Roman Empire at that time, took over the ruins and entrusted them to the Counts of Thierstein in 1479. This stronghold was, in a way, a poisoned chalice, because what was entrusted to the Thiersteins was in ruins. And these ruins had to be rebuilt, which was a considerable endeavor.
In the 15th century, the military evolved considerably with the advent of cannons, weapons of unrivaled power. These developments compelled fortresses to reinvent and strengthen themselves in order to resist. To keep its defensive function, the Haut-Koenigsbourg was completely changed.
The Haut-Koenigsbourg that was transformed and rebuilt in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was significantly different from the original. That transformation was quite considerable. There was an adaptation to this new mode of defense. In the 15th century, the castle was rebuilt to withstand the use of artillery, thanks to the addition of thick walls, an adapted plan, and gunboats that didn't exist in the previous castle.
The keep, an essential element, was rebuilt. In the Middle Ages, it was this main observation tower of the castle that warned of dangers, hence its importance. The dwellings, the second essential element of the castle, were also rebuilt. To the west, the Thiersteins erected two large artillery towers connected by a wall called a curtain. Together, they made up the so-called Grand Bastion, a defensive architectural ensemble that began to appear in the 15th century. It was specially designed to withstand artillery. With 9-meter thick walls on the south tower and a 5-meter thick connecting wall, this colossal complex aimed to protect the most vulnerable side of the castle.
What the Thiersteins did was quite complex. The most striking thing was the Great Bastion to the west. It had extremely thick walls with bunkers that featured cannons. In fact, the Great Bastion was so thick that the summit platform could hold additional cannons. The west side was pretty much on the ground, so it needed the best defense and be properly equipped for counterattacks.
The Great Bastion protected the only side vulnerable to an attack. Because the other sides of the castle were built on a slope, the use of cannons was much less effective. On the west side, however, artillery could be placed on the ridge, a roughly flat surface, so it could be fired at point-blank range. This is why the Great Bastion had extremely thick walls. In addition to the monumental Great Bastion, two other military works completed the structure on the other side of the castle. The small bastion protected the forecourt and the dwellings, while the star-shaped bastion was located at the eastern tip of the mountain. Although its walls were not as thick as those of the Great Bastion, its design was undoubtedly the most innovative of the fortress. It seems to have been inspired by the blueprints of brand new castles on the other side of the Alps, in Italy.
The star-shaped bastion shows the castle's evolution. The shape was much straighter and it had no blind spots. This bastion was a move towards modern fortification. I think the architect who designed it was aware of those early Italian plans and wanted to adapt them to this castle. So he designed a system with elements that worked together, creating a relatively complete defense system.
When one looks at the star-shaped bastion, one notices that the gunboats, the spots where cannons are placed, are oriented so as to defend all the walls that connect the structure. As a result, there are no blind spots, making it a resolutely modern building for the time and completely unheard of in the region. The last defensive element was a perimeter wall that surrounded the site. Scientists estimate that the 15th century castle was at least 2.5 times larger than that of the 12th century. Its total surface area exceeded 36,000 square meters, the equivalent of over 5 football fields combined. It is the largest fortress ever erected in Alsace. But the Kirchsteins went even further. In the earlier medieval castle, one probably arrived from the ridge to the west. The Kirchsteins developed a way of entering through the south face along the rocky wall. They began a giant excavation project and even went so far as to dig into the side of the mountain.
Digging a rocky outcrop is always a tedious work done with hammers, spikes, and chisels. Considerable amounts of rock were extracted, which required a large number of workers.
In all, thousands of cubic meters of rock were cut, a laborious task that took several years. But why did the Kirchsteins embark on such a project?
The reason for this change in access was to make the castle harder to penetrate. To enter the Haut-Koenigsbourg, you had to go through a first door, then a second, and a third. These separate doors were perpendicular to the rocky barrier, which made it possible to prevent access, even more by shooting from the main enclosure. The enemy could be blocked in the cul-de-sac formed by the various doors.
Thanks to this complete restructuring, the Kirchsteins achieved their goal, displaying their power by erecting one of the most exceptional and modern fortresses of its time. Unfortunately, modernity only lasts for so long.
All the castles of this period had a problem. From the 15th century onward, artillery continued to improve. What was effective 50 years before was no longer effective, and what was effective then wouldn't be effective 50 years later. The defenses had to be continuously perfected, which was extremely expensive. At the Haut-Koenigsbourg, a few measures were taken, but not many. The first and easiest was to level off the keep. Why? Because at that time, a keep did more harm than good. It was an easy target for enemy artillery, and if it collapsed under cannon fire, it would do so on the rest of the castle. Obviously, that was something to be avoided.
The construction of a castle in the Middle Ages required considerable financial resources. Many families had lost all or part of their fortune in the construction or reconstruction of their fortress.
Did the work on the Haut-Koenigsbourg ruin the Kirchsteins financially? It's hard to say. Nevertheless, the lowering of the keep by about 10 meters was the only substantial modernization carried out at the castle during the second half of the 16th century, at which time the Kirchsteins parted with their fortress. For the Haut-Koenigsbourg, this was the beginning of a long decline. In July 1633, the Swedes, at war with the Holy Roman Empire, besieged the castle, which was destroyed in a fire. In 1648, Alsace became French again, which had no impact on a potential reconstruction of the castle. In the 17th century, the Haut-Koenigsbourg was nothing more than a ruin. 200 years passed before anyone became interested in what was left of the fortress. In 1871, following the French defeat in the Prussian War, Alsace became German again. 30 years later, the mayor of Sélestat offered the ruin of the Haut-Koenigsbourg to Emperor Wilhelm II. He immediately agreed. He saw the Haut-Koenigsbourg, a true symbol of German military greatness in the Middle Ages, as a way to legitimize his power over reconquered Alsace. In an exceptional move, he decided to completely rebuild the castle as it was in the 15th century. His aim was to transform the fortress into a museum to the glory of Germanic knighthood. It was a very ambitious project, one he wanted to carry out in less than 10 years. For Wilhelm II, the symbolic reconstruction had to prove to the world the modernity and power of his empire. Bodo Ebhardt, an architect specializing in fortresses, was put in charge of the restoration. Ebhardt moved away from the whimsical restorations of the 19th century and chose a much more rigorous, innovative approach, based on a discipline that had just appeared: archaeology.
Bodo Ebhardt hired workers to clear the base of the walls to understand what material he was dealing with. In a second step, he then asked the workers to systematically store all the old objects they would find as they cleared the walls. In order to convince the workers not to throw anything away, he paid them based on the level of interest of the objects they would retrieve. And these objects were then used in the restoration.
A total of 10,000 cubic meters of stone were cleared and 35,000 archaeological fragments collected. At the time, this was a considerable undertaking. Bodo Ebhardt also engaged in an unprecedented photographic campaign. Invented a few decades earlier, this technique offered an invaluable testimony to the state of the ruin and the progress of the construction site. In total, over 150 photographs were taken.
When we restore a castle in this day and age, taking a lot of photos is a normal thing. But Ebhardt took an unusual number of photos for 1900. He also drew many blueprints and took an incredible number of notes analyzing the site in the state it was in before the restoration. We're extremely lucky to have a ton of archives pertaining to his work. It was quite rare to have so many writings, photos, and archaeological excavations at the time. I think it was because Wilhelm II made it clear that the restoration had to happen beyond reproach of any kind, so it had to be done well.
Once the first step was over, the reconstruction had to be organized. And the first problem to be solved was how to bring water to the site. The geographical location of the Haut-Koenigsbourg at an altitude of over 750 meters made access to water extremely complicated. From the beginning of the restoration work, Bodo Ebhardt considered its delivery a priority.
Supplying water to the castle was a crucial issue. Water was needed for both construction and as a bare necessity of life. It's usually drawn from nearby fountains, but here, they were still quite low on the slope. Once construction began, cisterns were built, which collected rainwater from the roofs.
In the Middle Ages, 3 cisterns were present in the Haut-Koenigsbourg in distinct places. The first, with a capacity of 12,000 liters, was in the inner courtyard. The second, with a capacity of about 20,000 liters, was hidden in the extension of the west dwelling. The third and largest, with 33,000 liters of water, was located in the upper garden. In total, these tanks could hold up to 65,000 liters of water, the capacity of a medium-sized swimming pool. It was an absolutely vital water supply in the Middle Ages. But the clearing work undertaken by the German architect also revealed a fact about the Alsatian mountain fortress that was practically unheard of.
The Haut-Koenigsbourg had a 62-meter deep well, which was relatively rare. This required skilled mining workers who knew how to detect leaks and to dig an entire duct.
Traces of tools still visible inside the well allow us to reconstruct the drilling method used in the Middle Ages. The workers began by digging a peripheral gorge about 30 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters deep into the stone using a spike, a small pointed hammer used in mines. The central core was then cut out using various tools such as wedges, sledgehammers, and crowbars. The accumulated rubble was brought to the surface with the help of a jack or a winch, the ancestors of the crane. Once this work was completed, a new peripheral gorge was dug. The central core was cut again, and so on, until it reached the phreatic table at a depth of 62 meters. Coincidentally, the depth of the well was equivalent to the height of the keep. Drilling a well in the Middle Ages was a technical feat, and the cost could be as high as half the total cost of the castle. At the Haut-Koenigsbourg, this titanic work took several years. Bodo Ebert decided to restore the well at the very beginning of the construction, a task that remained as complicated as ever in the 20th century.
Even in the 19th century or early 20th, clearing a well more than 60 meters deep took a lot of time. The means they used back then were the same as those in medieval times. Therefore, it took Bobo Edhart several months to completely empty the entire well. Bobo Edhart cleared the well hoping to find a trapped water table, which was to be expected. Of course, the problem that arose was the same that the creator of this well had encountered a few centuries earlier. He found himself high and dry, both figuratively and literally, because the well that Ebhart had cleared provided an amount of water that was far insufficient with regard to the actual needs of the construction site.
It was therefore essential to supplement the water supply in a secure way. This time, Ebert decided to rely on much more modern techniques. He began building a catchment station to collect water from a spring below the castle. A pumping station was constructed nearby to carry water to the castle with a gasoline-powered pump. 3 8,000-liter underground tanks completed the set. From the spring, the cast-iron pipeline followed a route no less than 810 meters long, with a 120-meter elevation to the castle. The water was carried up to 2 metal tanks with an 8,000 and 5,000-liter capacity, located at the top of the keep that Ebert transformed into a water tower. From these tanks, the water then flowed under the effect of gravity to the various parts of the castle. Excess water was evacuated by a gargoyle, Bodo Ebert's nod to medieval architecture. Thanks to this state-of-the-art system, the castle had running water by 1900. This setup continued to provide water to the fortress until 2013. The problem of running water solved, another equally important one remained: the supply of stones to the site. The Haut-Koenigsbourg is famous for its stone. It has a bright pink shimmer that is majestic and recognizable among all.
The Haut-Koenigsbourg was entirely built in the Middle Ages and restored in the 20th century using pink sandstone, also known as Vosges sandstone. This material can be found all over the surrounding mountain in the Vosges Massif. Most of the large buildings in the area were built of this stone in the Middle Ages. It can be cut and sculpted more easily than granite, for example. This reddish pink or orange color comes from iron oxide.
The pink color from the presence of iron oxide in this rock obviously gives it a particular appearance, and it lends itself to carving in a fabulous way. The bossed block that made up the shell of the Haut-Koenigsbourg became the trademark of the stone.
On the stones of the Haut-Koenigsbourg, protrusions can be observed that give the sandstone blocks a rounded appearance. This technique, called bossing, was very fashionable in the Middle Ages and offered many advantages.
The bossed block was a technical element. The stone could be carved quickly into its shape and then inserted into the wall. The relief had no military function. Some say it was used to make cannonballs ricochet, but that's false. However, grouping together many of these blocks creates an impression of rock, which gives off a certain look of power in the masonry.
This technique was used by Bodo Ebart in the 20th century. The workers were instructed to use the stones of the medieval building found during the clearings. But these blocks of stones, sometimes damaged or simply missing, were not enough. A quarry was hence opened a few hundred meters from the castle on the same ridge.
A quarry is preferably situated on a ridge so that materials don't have to be carried up. We're talking about tons of stone. It isn't fun hoisting them up a mountain. It's better to keep them on the same level. In this respect, Ebhart simply repeated what had been done by his predecessors a few centuries earlier.
On the other hand, the techniques put into place to transport the stones were not at all the same. In the Middle Ages, moving these sandstone blocks was a titanic job because of the rugged terrain.
To carry stone, you need a path. When you have a quarry that's far away, you need a path to get there. With medieval means, a cart could move something like half a ton of stones per trip at the most. We're talking 2 or 3 blocks in the scope of things.
Only a few blocks of sandstone per day could be transported to the construction site. But for Bodo Ebart, it was imperative to satisfy the will of his emperor. The reconstruction had to go quickly. Conveying the stones, in particular, was an extremely important issue. To that end, the German architect used state-of-the-art techniques to speed up the transport of the blocks.
To bring the sandstone blocks from the quarry to the castle, a small circuit with rails was set up so that a small steam locomotive could complete the task.
The steam locomotive had a clear purpose. The idea was to use the resources available at the beginning of the 20th century, namely motor power. This allowed them to transport considerably larger amounts much faster.
A railway track was built the entire length of the ridge, spanning the 300 meters that separated the quarry from the construction site. The road workers had to clear the surface of this rugged terrain to make it flat, which was a considerable preliminary job. The delivery of the locomotive was also a real headache. Made in Germany, transported by train, and weighing more than 5 tons, it had to be hoisted from the bottom of the mountain to the top, more than 700 meters higher. Over 15 harnessed horses were needed to achieve this feat. On January 18, 1902, the first train loaded with materials made the journey. 1 or 2 mining rail cars were attached to the locomotive placed on the rails. Thanks to this extremely ingenious and very modern process, dozens of blocks were transported to the construction site in record time.
I'm personally not familiar with all the restoration sites of large buildings. However, something like this was unheard of in Alsace at the beginning of the 20th century. This type of infrastructure, complete with railway and such modernity, was really significant, clearly.
In the meantime, the reconstruction work began. And just like the means deployed for the delivery of water and materials, it proved to be at the cutting edge of technology and extremely ambitious. All trades were called upon. Machinists, stone carvers, masons, carpenters, as well as innkeepers to take care of meals. From about 40 in winter, the number of workers rose to 220 in the summer. For the early 20th century, this was a monumental project. Incredibly, the entire site, nearly 500 square meters, was supplied with electricity by a system connected to a transportable steam engine. The locomobile, the ancestor of our current generators.
Getting electricity to a summit 750 meters above sea level at the beginning of the 20th century was a prowess. That's undeniable. The villages and towns below didn't even have any. You can see that considerable resources were used to carry out a quality restoration that wouldn't drag on for decades.
The reconstruction work itself began in 1901 with the keep. The primary reason was political.
The keep was the highest point of the castle. It was not only the observation post, but also what you see from afar. So rebuilding the keep first was a clear way to show that something was happening at the top of the mountain.
The stones of the medieval building also prevented all circulation around the ruin, so the second reason was logistical. Its reconstruction was based on the ruins of the old keep, dating from the 12th century, one of the few vestiges of the original castle. The foundations of the walls, about 2 meters thick, clearly indicated a square plan. To rebuild it, Bodo Ebhardt went big. Inside the walls, he installed a state-of-the-art electric crane. Its arm, more than 9 meters long, could lift loads weighing up to 1 ton over a height of 40 to 50 meters, a contraption that was unheard of in Alsace.
In 1900, setting up an electric crane on a construction site did indeed happen at some cathedrals and urban buildings in big cities, where electricity was easy to produce. But doing so in the middle of the countryside in the mountains was quite exceptional.
Thanks to the technical resources deployed, the restoration project moved extremely fast. Once the reconstruction of the keep began, Bodo Ebhardt continued with the south enclosure to secure the site's facilities. He then tackled the reconstruction of the dwellings. As for the seigneurial residence, the German architect was able to rely on important remains. The kitchens were still in place, which greatly facilitated the restoration work. On the other hand, the part that stretched from the western dwelling to the Great Bastion, which was difficult to access, was much more complicated to rebuild. To achieve this, Bodo Ebhardt imagined a particularly ingenious arsenal. Between the walls of the upper garden that were still present, he built a gigantic structure designed to support rails. This structure extended from the Great Bastion to the western dwelling. Over these rails, a cradle was installed, capable of rotating 360 degrees and moving from west to east over several dozen meters. This device was complemented by an electric crane that could lift loads weighing up to 1.5 tons. This process made it possible to mount several blocks of sandstone at once and to move them from one end of the structure to the other very easily, so as to rebuild areas that would otherwise be difficult to reach. Once again, this device had never been seen before in Alsace. This crane allowed Bodo Ebhardt to rebuild all the walls, sentry walks, and roofs of the western part of the castle in record time.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the German Empire was a modern country that wanted this modernity to be seen, especially at the Château du Haut-Koenigsbourg, which was a symbolic restoration for Emperor Wilhelm II. All human, modern, and technological means were put forth to make this vast construction site a modern showcase.
The reconstruction of the Haut-Koenigsbourg ended with the star-shaped bastion, the easternmost part of the building. Bodo Ebhardt chose to restore the Haut-Koenigsbourg to its most spectacular appearance, that of the 16th century. In all, the reconstruction of the Haut-Koenigsbourg cost 2,350,000 marks, the equivalent of 70 million euros today. It was a fortune for the time. The work lasted less than 8 years, an extremely short turnaround.
I do think the duration of this restoration from 1901 to 1908 was extremely short. Let's not forget that Willem II came once a year to verify the progress of the project. He was very proud of his castle being restored to its Middle Ages appearance. I'm sure that he must have insisted on multiple occasions that it should be done quickly.
Although the work moved fast, Bodo Ebert was still methodical. A close look at the walls of the building reveals that small engravings are visible on some of the stone blocks. These marks are not there by chance. They provide valuable information about the temporality of the site.
Bodo Ebert liked to date and mark his work. The region was legibility. He wanted to claim the work was done on behalf of the emperor and not a medieval predecessor. That way things were clear. When you look at the work overall, it gives the impression of a homogeneous endeavor. But when you look at the stone carefully, you see what was done by Bodo Ebert in the early 20th century as opposed to what was from the medieval era. This represents a very modern restoration code of ethics. Hats off to him.
The restorer used a method frequently seen in the Middle Ages. At the Haut-Koenigsbourg, engravings dating back to the 16th century are still visible. At that time, the workers marked each of their stones, since they were paid based on the number of blocks they would cut per day. But in the 20th century, these marks had a very different function.
He dated his work site by creating a calendar. Every year of construction was dated by a particular type of mark. Since the restoration lasted from 1901 to 1908, there are 8 marks that are found in the entire castle. In the keep, most marks are from 1901 and 1902. The Alsatian house has marks from 1904 to 1906, and the star-shaped bastion bears marks from 1906, so you can see the progress of his work.
These marks allow us to precisely establish the progress of the construction site year after year. To avoid confusion, Bodo Ebert had several chart summaries engraved on the castle stones, along with a poem to the emperor's glory. Of the 8 graphics chosen, 5 were connected with Wilhelm II. There were 3 variants of his emblem, as well as a representation of the imperial eagle and a crown. The other 3 graphics were just as symbolic. Those were Bodo Ebert's emblem, a stylized tower or castle, and finally, the Alsatian coat of arms. By reprising a centuries-old method, Bodo Ebert became, in his own way, part of the great lineage of the builders of the Haut-Koenigsbourg. But he also offered an extremely precise reading of the restoration of the building. In 1908, the work was almost finished. In record time, Bodo Ebert had managed to rebuild an edifice that looked straight out of the Middle Ages. As we look at the Haut-Koenigsbourg today, everything suggests that the reconstruction proposed by the German architect was perfectly faithful to the original building. The truth is somewhat different. The architect had indeed taken certain liberties. The Kaiser's room, located on the 2nd floor of the western dwelling, wasn't restored according to the original plans. Yet Bodo Ebert had important remains at his disposal. The consoles on the pillars, as well as the windows on the 2nd level, attested to the existence, in an earlier area, of a floor and several rooms that were not rebuilt. Wilhelm II asked that this hall be particularly prestigious, as a token of the strength and importance of his empire. In essence, Bodo Ebert had to follow the imperial will both inside and outside the castle.
What is less known is that Bodo Ebert drew up several plans to restore the entire fortress. And one of his first drafts aimed at recreating a military fortress, one that featured very low roofs. This clearly did not please the Chancellery or Wilhelm II. And as a result, the current appearance of the castle is more striking in size, both in terms of the framing and also the height of the keep, which is perhaps a little exaggerated. Over time, he tried to give the castle an absolutely magnified appearance.
The castle in its present form reflects the will of the emperor who wanted to make the Haut-Koenigsbourg a mirror of German power, right down to the roofs. In general, as all the upper parts of the castle had disappeared, they were redesigned by Bodo Ebert. Were the sentry walks covered? Is the majestic roof of the great bastion faithful to the medieval building? In the absence of remnants, that is impossible to say. What is certain, however, is that at the end of the 16th century, the keep no longer had this look.
Where he compromised was in rebuilding the keep. That keep was undoubtedly square. Everyone agrees on that. But at the time of its demolition in 1633, it's well known that this castle no longer had a visible keep, because with the development of artillery, it became an ideal target. Wanting to avoid that, the occupants of that period decided to lower the height of the keep by 2 peaks. The keep might seem shocking when put in its historical context, but no one today can imagine a castle without it. Just look at Lego and the number of toys out there that deal with the Middle Ages. It's shocking from a historical point, but not from an aesthetic one.
Bodo Ebert also worked according to the collective imagination of his era. When it came to the staircase of the inner courtyard, the architect also took liberties. At this very spot, the remains attested to the presence of a spiral staircase in medieval times. Bodo Ebert faithfully rebuilt it. However, the large windows that adorn the stair tower probably didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Their delicate, refined style is much closer to Renaissance works than to a staircase in a medieval fortress. This example is emblematic of the architect's method. Where remnants existed, he relied on them rigorously. But if they had disappeared, he took the license to reinvent around them. With that in mind, are we to say that Bodo Ebert faithfully restored the castle? The Haut-Koenigsbourg of the early 20th century may well be a reconstruction of a medieval Alsatian fortress, but it doesn't render the exact appearance of the building of the late 16th century. That said, it's a plausible copy, at least for the overall structure of the castle.
We must always distinguish between restorers and architects. A pure restorer will stop where they can no longer go beyond what the old building reveals to them. Bodo Ebert was a restorer architect, but an architect nonetheless. He was able to create using examples he knew very well, as he specialized in castles. He could tap into numerous examples. He relied on these examples to defend his stance, saying it was actually possible to restore a work even though you didn't know how it used to look exactly. You could come close.
He tried to do his best, with great honesty and a great power of persuasion. But this is still a late 19th century restoration, and every period of restoration is always marked by the environment.
While criticism was fierce at the time, especially from Francophiles opposed to Wilhelm II's project, today's experts agree on the quality of Bodo Ebert's work. It took almost a century for the restoration proposed by the German architect to regain respectability. Over its 900 years of history, and thanks to its unique position, the Haut-Koenigsbourg has had many different looks, belonged to the most prestigious Germanic dynasties, and survived the vagaries of the 20th century. It's an extraordinary destiny for an exceptional castle. Today, the building that rises before our eyes, this emblematic site of Alsatian heritage, welcomes over 500,000 visitors a year, making it one of the most visited castles in France. Bodo Ebert succeeded in his gamble. With an almost faithful rendition, he offers visitors a true journey back in time into the heart of a unique fortress.
The main feature is that it's the only major castle that's ever been rebuilt. When you visit it, you can quickly go several centuries into the past. It's an architectural spectacle, no doubt about it. The Haut-Koenigsbourg is straight out of a childhood dream, and I think every human being should hold on to their childhood dreams.
Its particular, almost legendary appearance inspired some of the greatest artists of the 20th century, such as Goro Miyazaki and his animated film Tales from Earthsea, and John Howe for the Lord of the Rings saga. Its architecture fascinates far beyond the Alsatian borders. Specialists, on the other hand, continue to study and scrupulously ponder its stones.
I don't think all the research is complete. To me, there are several puzzles that remain. And we haven't explored all the sources either.
In the years to come, new secrets could be discovered. Proof that the legendary Haut-Koenigsbourg may not have revealed all of its mysteries just yet.